Thanks very much. Should designated public office holders be permitted to own assets that rest in tax havens?
So I will read into your question about whether or not designated public office holders or reporting public office holders or public office holders for that matter are able to have assets that are controlled by a blind trust. And I think the answer is resoundingly yes.
So the question is specifically about the assets, in this case, if they're in a blind trust, being in a tax haven. So if the investment is one made in a tax haven, is that appropriate for a parliamentary secretary, a minister, a prime minister to hold their assets in tax havens?
Okay, so the first thing I would ask you is, what do you define as a tax haven? The colloquial term for that is something where taxes can be deferred to a later date when the asset is dispossessed and the gain is actually realized. Okay, another way of looking at it is a jurisdiction that has a lower rate of tax based on income or whatever the threshold test in that jurisdiction is for generating that income. Individual citizens, individual corporations should organize their affairs in a way that they seek to minimize their own taxes if that is consistent with the laws of the jurisdiction which they are operating in.
And for the people for whom this act is constructed?
So I don't see the issue. I mean, that is, I don't like the term tax haven. I think there's a pejorative aspect to it. I think it's organizing one's affairs in a way that minimizes tax.
Yeah, it certainly minimizes their payment of taxes here in Canada to support all of the things that taxes are designed to pay for. I think that when we have a government that sets policy that sees Canadians who might not have the means to afford those types of investment strategies as you've described them, that it hurts Canada when these people are supposed to be serving in the best interests of Canada, which kind of speaks to this broader question of blind trusts and whether or not we can just simply assume that everyone is operating in the best interests of Canada. We heard from the commissioner that his belief or his experience is that assets that go into the blind trust, those investments that go into the blind trust, they come out looking the same. That the trustees don't really trade, they don't really sell them, and so the decisions that those decision makers are taking can be made knowing what the impact is on specific investments. The challenge that creates for Canadians who have a cratering confidence in public institutions and public office holders is that they believe that when they take a look at the act or it's explained to them, or we've heard many times that someone would say, I've divested all my assets. Well, that's a very cute way that it's been characterized in the act, that you can divest into a blind trust where they're likely going to just stay in the exact same form as when you put them in, as opposed to them not being sold. So it really has to do with, you came out of the gate and said that you think they're great, the blind trusts. Do you think that they do service to the improvement or improving on Canadians' confidence in elected officials, that they're acting in the best interest of the country and not the best interest of themselves, like, for example, one who would hold office while also holding their assets somewhere where they don't have to pay tax here in Canada to pay for all of the things that Canadians rely on: public health care, transportation, border security, our national police force, and so on.
So I think the first thing I would do is I take you back to your question about the tax havens and say, well, it's a good thing the last budget talked about the global minimum tax, which would do a lot to equalize that. on a country by country basis. The second thing is I would actually question the underlying assumption that your question is based on, and I use what I call the soccer field and ringette arena test. And when I talk to the people that I spend time with while watching our children play sports, they don't bring this up as an issue that is of concern. Like, they have more fundamental concerns, and far be it for me to tell you what your constituents are telling you. You've got their ear at the door, absolutely. But I think if you've got a specific example of a particular trade that you think is going to create that conflict of interest, I think you're behooved to make that statement public and to put it forward.
So I guess what I'd say with my remaining time is that I have heard at the soccer fields and at the hockey rinks that people are concerned that that a prime minister who would seek to pass laws on them that would see them remit their taxes while they're struggling is also holding investments in offshore tax havens and not paying his fair share. And that does bother them. That is something that bothers them. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Barrett. Right on time, 6 minutes.
Thank you, and welcome. Do you agree with me that ethics is more demanding than law? In other words, something can be legal, but that doesn't make it moral. Thank you for the question. I'd like to answer in French, but I'm not. I prefer not to answer a technical answer. I would like to prove to my daughters that I can speak some French, a little bit.
With you, I think Dr. Turnbull said the same thing in her testimony, that you can't legislate ethics. The ethics stand above what the legislation is. I would tell you that rules, and I mentioned this in my testimony, rules will often form the cultural underpinning for developing that moral compass that will guide individuals as they make those decisions. There are a lot of things that go into establishing the individual ethics and morality of individual humans. Some people have a very different prism through which they look at these things. Some of them are very matter of fact. Some of them are far more deliberate.
Est-ce à dire que...
So in other words, even if we were to change the law, or even if we were to introduce the concept of apparent conflict of interest, or it could be introduced elsewhere with control mechanisms, at that point, would you consider that the apparent appearance of conflict of interest is an important notion in ethical governance? Because from what you're saying now, it seems to completely exclude this through a legalistic vision, and therefore exclude the whole concept of apparent conflict of interest. And so we have a problem with the unusual situation in which we find ourselves now. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Maybe not as long as me, because I have another question after.
And that we always have a tension between what we can write down in a law and what the driving ethic behind those laws may be. I mean, to put it into the law means that at some step in the future, you're going to have to be able to prove it. If you're going to use that aspect of the law, you're going to have to be able to adduce evidence to suggest that something has happened. I will tell you, however, that I agree with you, that when you talk about these things, and for a particularly like this one, you are participating in that conversation that will shape and drive that discussion. The history is replete with examples where society has changed its mind because of discussions just like this one in a full, frank, and fair manner. Today, I think that creating a test on the appearance of a conflict is going to create more problems that it solves. That might not be the case in 20 years.
Ce qui est visé, c'est qu'il y ait confiance.
But we want the people to trust our democratic institutions. Do you believe that the highest function involves the highest level of being exemplary? And if you say yes, because you seem to indicate that you would say yes, the unusual situation in which we find ourselves, where we have a PM with a $1 billion fund controlling 900 companies, doesn't this expose the PM to this very appearance of conflict of interest? When you see a very specific situation, you like specifics, I know. The Prime Minister has announced various projects for high-speed transportation. There's nuclear reactors in Ontario. So this is rather quick, fast-track projects. This would open a whole new market for the 3 companies on the planet who offer this type of product, one of which belongs to Brookfield. And the Prime Minister should not be benefiting Brookfield. So the so-called filters and the law regarding conflict of interest would have prevented the Prime Minister from intervening in selecting the companies among those 3. But he was not asking for recusal from the decision because that would give a benefit to the whole sector, even if there are very few players here. So is this to be considered no conflict of interest because it's general? Because really, from a strictly appearance point of view, we should be questioning this. But the current filters, or the filter in question, does not allow for that kind of control. We're not talking about just anybody. We're not talking about a simple minister. We're talking about the Prime Minister, who is deciding everything when it comes to economic orientations. So what is to be done if we can't change the law? How can we introduce mechanisms that would be equal to the ethical criteria that you claim to share with me?
Super quickly.
45 seconds.
45 seconds.
Street. So there are government decisions that, based on the portfolio that the Prime Minister had, the investments that he had, would be disadvantaged, right? The government's work on the electric vehicle mandate, for example, suspending that would not help his shares in Tesla. The second thing that I would say is that you are yourself doing the exact work that we need to advance that. As a parliamentarian, you're pointing it out and you're putting it into the public domain. You're allowing for individual Canadians to examine the arguments that you're putting forward and making their decision on that, and they will have the opportunity to make that choice in the next election.
Thank you, Mr. Thurlow. Merci, Monsieur Thériault.